Soviet disk detected. To play the Allied missions, please insert the Allied disk.
Hello everyone, I'm a Broken Robot. There's a popular theme among intellectual writers that the genius of creativity is a curse and a blessing. World-renowned fiction writers such as Ernest Hemingway, H.P. Lovecraft, and Sylvia Plath are all writers that fit the stereotype that the weight of creative genius combined with a stagnant life can consume a creative thinker. Easily one of the most famous examples of this was American poet and original Goth Edgar Allan Poe. While the tragic events of his life gave him no satisfaction, leading to dying an early death, it fueled his dark, arcanic poetry that would go on to inspire Stephen King, Alfred Hitchcock, and Stanley Kubrick. Today I'd like to discuss The Raven, easily one of Poe's most famous yet overlooked pieces of literature. But before we can properly dissect the deeper themes and meaning behind his cautionary tale, we need to learn a bit more about Edgar Allan Poe himself, and how his tragic life directly fueled his masterpiece. Edgar Allan Poe was born in Richmond, Virginia on January 19, 1809, to a pair of popular actors, David and Eliza Poe. Within 2 years, his father ran off with a Southern belle, divorcing his wife the following year. Poe famously never got over his father's abandonment and carried it with him through the rest of his life. His mother would also tragically pass away when he was very young, which also would negatively affect him for the rest of his life. Poe's mother was buried near Church Hill in Richmond, in St. John's Church Cemetery, where she sits to this day. Many historians note that despite Poe's life of poverty, yearly he visited his mother's grave to leave flowers, and many noted that his weeping could be heard from blocks away. The orphan Edgar was taken in by a wealthy family of John and Frances Allan of Richmond, who were dear friends to Edgar's late mother. Although Edgar loved his adopted mother, Frances, and they had a healthy and strong bond that lasted until her death in 1829, John Allan, his adopted father, never really cared for the boy and only took him in out of the dying wishes of his wife's dear friend. Edgar and John fought with each other often, and many historians note that John regularly would beat Edgar, and sometimes would beat his wife Frances to torment Edgar when he misbehaved or was scolded in school. When Poe reached his teenage years, him and John often fought over money. John and Frances never legally adopted Edgar, meaning that Edgar would not inherit any money and had few prospects besides being sent off to boarding school when he reached adulthood. While Edgar Allan Poe had been struck by tragedy and abuse at a young age, he was an athlete, a swimmer, and a promising student that was very gifted in writing and literature. At 17, he became engaged to a wealthy local, Ermina Royster, and enrolled in the University of Virginia in Charlottesville to pursue knowledge for a career in writing. He was a good student, but when John Allan wouldn't pay the bills for college, Edgar took to gambling to raise funds, and finally, after acquiring a habit for gambling and thousands of dollars in debt, he was reduced to breaking up furniture and burning it to keep warm. After his adopted father, John, learned of Edgar's mismanagement of what little money he gave him, Edgar was cut off from his adopted parents and would sadly never see his father again, and sparingly saw his mother Frances a handful of times over the rest of his life. Being forced to drop out of school, he returned to Richmond to find that Elmira's father had intercepted their letters discussing Edgar's financial troubles. Her father broke off the engagement and Elmira was now engaged to someone else. At 18, with few options, he enlisted in the army under the name of Edgar A. Perry. He was at times a good soldier, rising to the rank of sergeant major and even being allowed to enter the prestigious West Point Military Academy. But it was not long before he acclimated enough to merit to be dismissed. Edgar was known to miss roll call on many occasions due to spending a lot of time in the nearby woods writing, and he was caught on numerous occasions sneaking out to local towns to drink in pubs. After being kicked out of the army, he took to writing poems and stories, and in 1835 his work brought him the attention to the Southern Literacy Messenger, a small Richmond subscription magazine that was trying to project the South as a home to great literature. Edgar was hired as the editor and published his first tale of psychological terror, Bernice. He had a strange affliction when it came to his physical and mental health. One drink would make him drunk and even incapacitate him for days. Some historians theorize that complications with his birth prevented his liver from fully developing, increasing the effects of alcohol. He was also known to be a gambler and suffered from depression and melancholy for most of his life, being known to wander the streets late at night and staring blankly into walls and windows in a trance-like state. And then in Richmond, he married his 13-year-old cousin, funny enough. While this was done under the permission of his aunt and uncle, Even in an era where men were known to marry young and cousin marriage wasn't as taboo, this raised eyebrows and caused them both to move away from town to town very often. While it's easy to discount Poe for marrying so young and marrying his own cousin, Poe experts explain that he simply wanted to be close to the only remaining family he had, despite its rather nauseating nature. In an era before copyright, Poe produced over 69 stories and dozens of popular poems, and he was admired by other writers like Charles Dickens. Though famous, he hardly made any money and lived in poverty all of his life. Tortured by alcoholism, bad luck, and misfortune, and an overall melancholy state, he acclimated thousands of dollars in gambling debt, but received just $10 for one of his most famous short stories, The Fall of the House of Usher. Working 14 hours a day and writing with a quill pen before a small fireplace, he wrote the first modern detective story, Murder in the Rouge Morgue, for which he was only paid $56 despite it being a national hit. He also wrote some of the first science fiction stories and such classical tales of terror as The Pit and the Pendulum, which he was only paid $38 for, The Telltale Heart, which he was paid $10 for, and The Black Cat, for which the Saturday Evening Post paid him just $20 despite it also being a national hit. His wife Virginia was always sickly, suffering from lung diseases and regularly fainting. Their poverty definitely didn't help. A visitor to Poe's last cottage in New York remarked that on cold days, poor Virginia had only Poe's wool coat from West Point and their cat to keep her warm. Virginia tragically died at 24 years old due to complications with breathing, and Poe passed into a nervous breakdown and depression that lasted for the rest of his life. This tragic event is what many historians believed inspired his most famous work, The Raven. After a failed attempt to remarry his first love, Elmira Royster, he spiraled into alcoholism, had a crippling gambling addiction that kept him in a permanent state of poverty, and had become estranged from any remaining relatives he had. On October 7, 1849, he was found dead outside his apartment building in Baltimore, Maryland. People had speculated that he had drank himself to death. Poe lived a long life filled with many tragedies and hardships that he carried to his grave. The themes of loneliness, grief, depression, and psychotic paranoia filled his life, and are found directly in The Raven, in an eerie echo of Edgar Allan Poe's life. The Raven is easily one of Poe's greatest works, not just for its deep themes that could be interpreted in an infinite amount of ways, but the poetry's internal writing style, ending the verse with a rhyming or style, sucks the reader directly into the world. The Raven starts with an unnamed protagonist sitting alone in his chamber, surrounded by a dying fire and his walls covered in books.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore.
As he's just about to fall asleep, he hears a knocking on his chamber door. This awakens him from his trance, and while he assumes it's simply a visitor, he pauses to open the door, as the first thought that comes across his mind when he's awoken isn't the fact that there might be a stranger in his home, but the lingering feeling of his own misery.
"'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly had I sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore.
Through the narrator's internal monologue, we learn that the narrator is brooding and just in a permanent state of depression over the loss of a woman named Lenore. It's implied that he was his wife, or perhaps a lover, and that the loss of this woman has basically altered this person's life for the worst. Only when a knocking comes again, this time much louder and menacingly than before, he breaks from his trance of depression and attempts to greet the visitor, but is bewildered to find no one present, and in fact the hallway, with its pitch-black dark aura, pierces directly into his soul. His fate is sealed and his descent into madness begins upon hearing the whispered word, Lenore. He is immediately frightened and turns back into his chamber to hide from his own home, questioning what he had just experienced.
Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly, your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here, I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into this darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. but the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more.
For those of you that haven't read The Raven, Lenore's the narrator's deceased wife that passed some time recently. The matter of her death is unknown and doesn't affect the story or the narrator, but her absence is the main catalyst for the narrator's visitor. The narrator, who is visibly and mentally in panic over what had happened in the hallway, feels compelled to rationalize what just had happened, and childishly tries to play it off as the wind, leading him to open his shutters. Upon opening his window, in flies a single raven that hops and flies onto the top of his chamber door, and perching on a bust of Pallas.
"'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door.
At first the narrator is relieved, believing that the raven is the cause of the noise, and jokingly mocks the raven in that it was harmless and knew no better. This takes a stark turn when the raven responds, "Nevermore." While it puts off the narrator, he tries to rationalize it as a trick bird that escaped his master. While only parrots can replicate human speech, he assumes that this bird was perhaps from a carnival show, or maybe even a one-of-a-kind bird escaped from some rich aristocrat. But regardless of the narrator's attempts to put himself at ease, the raven responds, "Nevermore."
Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore."
It then becomes apparent to the narrator that this raven isn't just a bird, but a personification of evil to mock him. While some analysts of Poes' work will claim that the narrator hallucinates these events, others and I hold the conclusion that this raven is a demon, or perhaps even the devil himself that's come from the nightly shore to mock the grief-stricken narrator. The narrator continues to try and rationalize the situation until he notices the distinct imprint of his dead lover on the sofa and smells her perfume, all while the raven continues to sit perched, looking down on the narrator. The narrator bluntly asks the raven, recognizing its cosmic position, if he will ever be reunited with his dead lover. But the raven mocks him by once again saying, "Nevermore."
That the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from some unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. "Wretch," I cried, "thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore."
This causes the narrator to have a breakdown, wildly screaming at the raven to leave him alone and take its beak from his heart so he may find peace, to which the raven responds with "Nevermore." The poem then abruptly ends with the narrator being driven mad, and the raven sits in his chamber door on the bust of Pallas eternally.
"Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend," I shrieked upstarting. "Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
The most obvious symbolism in the raven is the bird itself. Whether you choose to believe the raven is grief itself, or the devil coming to mock the narrator's fruitless brooding over his lost Lenore, the raven is an allegory of the dangers of grief, and how those that cannot let go of their sorrows and longing for someone who is no longer with them will consume oneself in the most barbaric way possible. Many Poe analysts believe that this poem was a direct reflection of Edgar Allan Poe's grief towards his father that abandoned him, his dead mother and dead adopted mother, and his failure to win over his first love. And of course the loss of his only remaining family, his cousin, who despite an awkward age gap he truly cared and loved for very much. The Raven serves as a cautionary tale for the reader. The Raven is something we all live with in one way or another. We as humans and robots have regrets, lost loved ones, and those that we long to see just one more time, that the very universe itself keeps from us. It's important as individuals to not let grief consume your entire life, forcing you to lock yourself away from the world, much like the narrator. The Raven makes several references to the night's Plutonian shore, implying that the narrator thinks that the Raven has been sent by the Greek god of the underworld to mock his grief, as if the narrator could strangle his Lenore back from the dead. This echoes the mysterious theme of the Raven, sitting perched on the bust of Pallas, or Athenia as she is more commonly known, as the goddess of wisdom and artistic prowess. This could very well mirror how Edgar Allan Poe felt that the grief and depression that he felt every day hindered his creative writing abilities, only sometimes having brief moments of inspiration followed by long drunken days of misery and self-loathing. Much like the narrator in The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe was consumed by his grief and suffered under the weight of longing for something and someone that was no longer possible to reunite with. The main takeaway from The Raven is to accept the burden of grief, but to carry the weight and not be held down by it, or else you will be consumed by it, much like the narrator, and sadly enough, Edgar Allan Poe himself. The Raven is one of my favorite pieces of literature ever made, and a poem that I reread often. I hope you all enjoyed my look at Edgar Allan Poe's life and its connections to his most famous work. I hope you all enjoyed the video and got a kick out of these more deeper philosophical video topics. Feel free to comment your thoughts down below. Do you think that the narrator is hallucinating the events that took place in the poem, or do you have other theories? I'd be more than happy to discuss in the comments down below. But more than anything, I'm so happy and thankful to have each and every one of you here in the audience today. You all make this show possible. I'd like to politely ask you to like and subscribe if you did enjoy the video. If you like this video, not only does it let me know that you guys want more content, but it helps me out personally in the YouTube algorithm, so hey, thanks a bunch. If you subscribe, you won't miss out on my future video essays, commentary, and reviews on whatever topic of the week has piqued my interest. I make video essays on everything from activism to niche video game topics, so there's something for everybody here on the Broken Robot Show. I hope you all have a great day, carry your grief nevermore, and stay cool.